What's up, guys? Flashwing here. Yeah, this is a whiteboard, not the motorcycle today. As you can see by the title of the video, I wanted to kind of do a little bit of a video about the planning of the month of insanity. I've had a few of you hit me up in private asking me a few questions about how I planned the trip, what I brought with me, a few other odds and ends, and some questions because some of you have decided or were already in the planning stages of doing your own motorcycle trip. So I thought I would bring some behind the scenes stuff about how I planned the trip, some of the things that I took into consideration, some of the things that I may have ignored or otherwise thought that were a little bit beyond my control. So I just want to preface this with the fact that there are tons of different ways you can plan a motorcycle trip. Some people like to take the planned route. Some people like to take the just get on the bike and ride route. There's no right or wrong way to do this. It's simply whatever you feel most comfortable with and whatever your particular style is. This is how I planned my trip. I don't want to give it the impression that this is the way I think all trips should be planned. I may do a different plan or a different method of planning the next time that I decide to take the bike on the road. But very simply, this is some of the stuff that I went through when I planned the month of insanity, and just to give you some ideas and to get you thinking. So let's go ahead and get into it. So the very first bits of consideration that we wanted to take into consideration was, I would say, goals of the trip. And so very simply, first goal, obviously, have fun. That's pretty self-explanatory, but of course we want to have fun. The next one was, of course, to see family. That was probably one aspect of the trip that this really wasn't a bike trip per se. You want a bike trip, you want to go and see sights and you want to ride roads. It's about the bike. This was more or less a visiting trip, with the bike being the mode of transportation. So that's what made this a little bit different than your typical bike trip. I would say most of the time, if you're going to take a motorcycle across the country, you're doing it because you want to do things that are centered around the bike specifically. But in this case, it was more of a visiting trip, so I didn't have a chance to do a lot of roads, and we'll get into that later. So have fun, see family, meet moto vloggers. So we wanted to do that. And of course, the other goal was to ride the bike. Of course, another goal would be to not die. That kind of is self-explanatory. Don't go to jail. There's a good one as well. But above all, we want to do something that's fun. I want to see my family. I want to meet motovloggers. And I want to ride the bike. Those are the specific goals of the trip with my crappy eraser. So the first thing is we have to take inventory of, how much time do I have? And apparently my pen is dying, so we're gonna have to switch over to a red pen. So what is my time? In this case, I had 3 weeks, which translated into approximately 21 to 25 days with vacation time and weekends off and stuff like that. So, and the next very basic thing that you need to figure out is how far are you going to go? In the case of the month of insanity, the destination was, and there goes my cap, Phoenix, to Indiana, sorry for my bad handwriting, and then back. So this trip at the top is about 2,500 miles. And so the return trip is going to be approximately, around, give or take, around 5,000 miles. I think the total distance was around 2,000 miles to 2,100 miles if you want to get really technical, but I knew that I was going to be riding the bike around Denver. I knew I was going to be riding the bike around Kansas City. I knew I was going to be riding the bike around Indiana. So I knew there was going to be extra miles built in. So when you're talking a total distance of, 5,000 miles. And then the next big indicator is, of course, how far can I ride? Now, this is in particular to how far can you ride in a single day. With the sport bike, it's going to be more uncomfortable. It's going to be more grueling. It's not a comfortable cruiser or touring bike. So the amount of miles that I knew that I could handle was going to be significantly less. The only real way to determine how many miles you can ride is really to go out and do a test ride. I had a chance to sort of do a test ride, and it was more or less, unfortunately, I didn't quite get the mileage that I wanted, but I knew that it was going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 to 500 miles. Now, there were some days that I kind of shot in the middle, but this was roughly the range that I knew that I could handle realistically. There was a particular day where I was supposed to go to Kansas City, and Kansas City was about 610 miles. That was actually on day 4, which was the longest day, where I didn't quite make that. And on the return trip, I actually split that up as well because I realized that making 600 miles in a single day was going to be too much. The thing is that already and we're talking saddle time, this was 8 hours. So when you start thinking about how far can I ride, the mileage is important, but the time is also critical because I wanted to, as a goal, we'll add this to the goal list here, I wanted to only ride with daylight. As you get out into the Midwest, you've got concerns about wildlife. You got deer. I mean, even in areas like Denver, you've got larger animals up there. They tend to come out during the evening a little bit more often. Even if they came out during the day, I'm going to have more visibility. I knew I was going to be going into areas that I've never been before, and you're more vulnerable on the motorcycle to wildlife and road debris and stuff like that. So I thought, if as long as I kept it to daylight, that I would have less risk of running into stuff that I couldn't see. So when you figure that my goal is to ride with daylight, this is June, you had the summer solstice on June 21st being the longest day. So I had approximately, 12 hours of daylight available. And if I was going to be riding when it got dark, I'm going to be wanting to ride in areas I'm most familiar with, which is either going to be Phoenix or it's going to be Indiana. Both of those areas I've spent considerable amounts of time in. I'm comfortable during the night. I know where I'm going. Otherwise, everywhere else, I want to ride with daylight. So when you're looking at 8 hours of available time in just the saddle, you got to account for stops. You're going to be stopping. In my case, let me clear some room off here. The next is, a fuel stop. Okay, well, the R1, I know gets, thanks to Adrian Nickelodeon in particular, 160 total miles of fuel. Now, I'm probably not going to be able to stay on the bike 160 miles every time, and because the fuel stops were unknown in terms of I didn't know how many there were going to be, what their frequency was, the distance between them, I figured that about stopping at 100 miles each time was going to be the way to do it. 100 miles would give me a good amount of distance. That's about 90 minutes, That's about 90 minutes a piece of being on the bike. as an average speed. So, riding an hour, sorry about that, riding an hour and a half without stopping, and then stopping at about 100 miles to refuel would give me about 30 miles of room to find a gas station without any kind of panic, and then an additional 30 miles while panicking. So I figured if I can't find another gas station within 60 miles, I'm probably doing something wrong. So just to backtrack, big question is time. How much time do you have? It should be 5,000 miles. What distance are you going to be covering in that time frame? And then, of course, deciding how are you going to spend your time. Now, I knew, so you had 3 weeks. I knew that, so you're talking 3 segments, basically. And I knew that it was going to take about 5 to 6 days to reach my destination, averaging about 400 to 500 miles a day. The time and the distance and all that stuff. So, call it 2,000 miles. You're looking at a minimum of 4 days. If I did 500 miles a day for 2,000 miles, 4 days minimum. Now, of course, you have to account for other things like weather, breakdown, stuff like that, which I'll cover when I talk about the risks of the trip. Right now, this is mainly the time that it would take me to ride. So minimum of 4 days, possibly 5. So I knew that week 1, was going to be riding to Indiana. Week 2 was going to be visiting with friends and family. And then week 3 was going to be riding back. Of course, though, there's going to be I would end up having like a layover in Denver, which was about the halfway point. I did that both going to Indiana and coming back. But the idea is to give yourself a breakdown of the amount of time that you're going to physically need to get to where you're going. And that way you can determine, can I actually physically make it to my destination and back before, the time runs out. I had to be back. I left, I left on June 5th. And June 29th, I had to report back for work. So, that was a hard date. I had to be back by June 29th, no later than that date. So that gives you the time frame, and provided that the math works out where that you can realistically make it to your destination and back, then your time frame is good. So that takes care of time. So once I determined that I was going to be once I knew I'd make it, once I knew that, okay, provided that, say, in an ideal world where everything happens exactly the way I wanted it to, where I feel good enough every day that I can make it to my next destination, the bike doesn't break down, I don't have a crash, nothing bad happens. I knew that 4 days minimum I can make it to my destination. All right, so that's good. So now we have to talk about risks. Some of this I know seems very obvious, especially to maybe some of you who have planned stuff like this before. I wanted to think of, basically it was a case of what could go wrong. And so I wanted to figure out what are all the things that I need to plan for in terms of disasters and risks. One, of course, the first risk is that I would die. Sounds stupid, I know it's funny, but the fact of the matter is that's a risk. I'm riding by myself across the United States on a motorbike. There is a possibility that I could be killed. That's definitely one risk. 2, I could break down. And that breaking down could be a variety of things. We'll just say that this is an engine breakdown of some kind. 3, flat tire. That's pretty self-explanatory. For weather, that's a big one. Let's see, 5. Lose money. That's a big one. 6. Like 6. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think the one I'm thinking of covers under if I get killed. Or we'll just say bodily harm, or even crash. Dying, crashing, bodily harm. This would pretty much cause the trip to come to an end. And of course, that's probably the big thing too, is what are the risks of, you want to think about what are the things that would absolutely destroy this trip. Something that would cause me to have to turn around or get on a plane and fly back to Phoenix, some kind of a catastrophic failure, something I couldn't recover from, all the way down to even just the simplest things that might cause you delays. So I could lose my money, maybe damaged or lost phone. Let me try to think some of the other risks that I may have had. They're all going to vary depending on what you're doing. Maybe, getting tired, being in pain. We'll start with those. Those are probably going to be, that's a pretty good list. I don't think this is the exhaustive list, but this is most certainly the big considerations that I had. Now, there are types of risk. There are risks that we can avoid. There are risks that we have to accept. There are risks that we can mitigate. Now, what's the difference? Now, this is not exactly in the correct order. Risks that we can avoid. Some of you guys who follow politics will laugh about this. They consider this the known knowns, or the KNOWNS. The acceptance. Like I said, this is not in the right order. This is the unknown unknowns. And this is the known unknowns. You guys can tell I've been going through project management training this week. So, risks that we know, we can try and avoid those as best we can. For example, riding during the day, what do we know? Okay, well, one of the risks that we definitely know is there's wildlife, there's debris. Think about drawing on the experiences you have as a rider. Those are going to be, for the most part, known knowns. Or, for instance, another known known could be severe weather conditions that are going to happen. Like, I was originally going to do this trip in May. I moved the trip to June because I had family that was not even going to be available in May. But during the first week in May, there were these huge sets of storms that blew through the central part of the country. That would have been a known known. We would have avoided that risk specifically by not going or waiting. So weather could possibly fall into a known known situation because we know ahead of time that it's going to be a risk and we want to avoid it. Risks that we want to mitigate. These are risks that we may not necessarily know, but that we want to try and mitigate either the impact or the probability of it happening. Flat tire would be a mitigation. Losing money would be a mitigation. Lost or damaged phone would be a mitigation. You could say getting tired and pain would be possibly a mitigation. These are things that we don't know if they're going to happen. There's a possibility that they could happen. So we want to try and do whatever we can to address those items and make them either less probable or at least make the impact of that risk significantly less so it doesn't impact us as much. Finally, you have acceptance, which acceptance is usually the unknown unknowns, and that's simply accepting that there is a risk. We don't know what the probability is. We don't know what the impact will be. I would say weather by far is somewhere between avoidance and acceptance. There is some mitigation that you can do with weather, rain gear, cold gear, hot weather gear. I chose to forego taking any rain gear, one because of the lack of space, and that was a risk that I had to decide to accept. You may choose to mitigate it with gear, but because of a lack of packing space and a lack of budget, I decided that I would simply accept the risk of rain and just deal with it as it came. You could say avoidance is very proactive, mitigation and acceptance are reactive to a certain extent, mostly reactive on acceptance and somewhat on mitigation. Anyway, just something to think about, just a thought process. So what do we do about these risks? Okay, so how do I address die or crash? Well, if you're riding solo on a bike and you get into a crash or you get injured, of course the aspect of the accident or the crash itself is a serious problem. But since I'm by myself, I don't have anyone else there to depend on. So I had to come up with a way to try and get someone to watch out for me so that if anything was to happen, I could somehow get some help. One way was a check-in. I had a couple of friends of mine here in Phoenix who I was checking in with regularly via text message. About every 6 hours, I would let them know where I was. I would send them a text message, say, hey, everything's cool, this is what's going on, this is where I'm going to be at. And then when I got to my final destination, I would let them know, hey, you guys are done for the day, everything's fine. Two was GPS / Scorpio. I really wanted to get a low jack or tracking system for the motorcycle, but what really put me on to Scorpio was the fact that it had a social media component as well as a real-time tracker through their website that didn't need to be activated only when the bike was being stolen. So what I decided to do is I gave this information to both my friends here in Phoenix as well as friends across the country who I would be meeting up with. And I gave them access to my Scorpio data so that they could see in real time where I was. And I basically told them, hey, check in on me every once in a while. If you don't see me moving for a particular period of time, try and get a hold of me. If you can't get a hold of me, call the police. Tell them that, to come and get me. One of my friends took it a little bit of a step further and actually loaded the Scorpio app on their phone. And since I had my early warning system turned on, every time I started the bike, you would get a text message every time the bike would get a shock or a tilt, which usually means I'm getting on or off the bike. There would be a text message, so they were actually able to see when I would start and stop the bike, which was even better. Later on, I give this information to my parents, and they watched while on my return trip and helped out quite a lot. In fact, my mom saved my bacon a couple of times, as you guys will see later in the series. There is another app called Life 360. You guys may or may not be familiar with. We actually use that here locally with a few riders. I like to call it the Stalker app. Life 360 is basically a social group application where it tracks everyone's GPS location in real time, and you're able to see where people are. You can set locations such as home or shopping centers or school, and you can be alerted if people leave or enter those locations. Really useful tool, something else to consider. But if you're riding solo, this is a great way to keep you safe if something were to happen. I had a friend of the family who died because he rolled his Jeep out in California and he was alone, and he perished because it took people several hours before they finally found him. So I wanted to make sure that if I got injured severely, there was a way for people to find me. The Scorpio unit is a GPS that does not require the phone. It simply requires a data signal, which I knew I'd have data the majority of the places I would be going. And Life 360 would rely on the phone. So you've also got redundancy. One fails, the other one picks up. Good stuff there. So that kind of covers that aspect. So the next one we want to talk about would be, say, a breakdown flat tire. T-I-R-E. Says these kind of go in the same category. All right. Bike breaks down, flat tire. So the first thing is getting the bike into top shape. I bought new tires. I bought new sprockets. And I bought a new chain off the bat without even questioning it. I went with OEM equipment with the sprockets and chain. It had the highest mileage, and it was the greatest strength for the most part. I wanted to make sure the bike would be bulletproof. I did oil change, coolant change, and I changed the brake fluid. Necessary? No, probably not. If you're on a budget, a serious budget, where you're really pinching pennies, coolant change, brake fluid change, not really necessary. My goal was to make sure that the bike was as bulletproof as possible. I did not want a mechanical failure of any kind to derail the trip. One, because I've been stranded far away from home with a dead vehicle. Not fun. Very expensive to get it back home. And two, it would derail my trip. The more time I spent fixing the bike was less time that I would spend visiting family and friends and riding across the country. It would have been a massive disaster. So this is how to get the bike into top shape before you leave. Now, once you're on the road, it becomes kind of a different story. Because now I don't have garage facilities. Now I don't have the luxury of being at home. So I have to find a way to come up with fixing the bike on the road. So take tools. Get yourself a kit. I ended up going with a Kriega toolkit where I was able to pack all the tools that I thought I would need over the course of the trip. And I kind of went down the list. I'm like, okay, thinking about all the stuff that I normally have to take apart in the bike, I arranged my tools for that stuff. The things that could become a problem but are not likely to be, like the cam chain tensioner, the shift linkage, things that might require adjustment along the way. Probably not, but you always end up in that situation where if you need that one tool and you don't have it, it's a big problem. Even more specifically, I also supplemented what I had in the toolkit that I knew would allow me to do the things I needed to do. So if I took tools, by and large, if there was something simple that broke, I might be able to fix it or at least mend it enough that I could get to my next destination. Next was a tire repair kit. Kansas was probably one of the areas that scared me the most because it was going to be the most remote. I would say between Denver and Kansas City was a real risky part of the country, in my opinion, because it was wide open. There's very little civilization. Breaking down in those areas would be prohibitively expensive and very risky from a time standpoint. Also goes into why I wanted to travel during the day, only because if you break down at night, your chances of anybody coming by during the evening are significantly less than during the day. They might not see you, which adds to the risk as well. So I thought, oh gosh, if I get a flat in the middle of Kansas, how the hell am I going to get back to my destination? So I got a tire repair kit. Size was also a consideration because of luggage, which I'll get into some of the packing stuff later. Aerostitch makes a great tire repair kit, which includes a mini compressor. Because, of course, I'm thinking, well, I can get the tire patch, but if I can't get the tire inflated, it won't matter. Well, the tire repair kit also comes with a compressor that would allow me to inflate the tire once it's repaired. And it's plugs, not necessarily patches. Not the greatest way to fix a tire, but it would get me to my next destination so I could figure out what I wanted to do. Those are probably the two main aspects that that I covered in terms of taking care of the bike. Take your tools, your tire repair kit, pack that stuff, but make sure the bike is in tip-top shape before you even leave for your trip to mitigate and minimize the risks of anything happening while you're gone. Some other stuff, the phone. I bought a protective case for the phone. I bought a life-proof case that was both bulky and sturdy as well as waterproof. It's not water resistant. You can actually fully submerge the phone in water, I think for up to like 10 meters, and it will keep the phone nice and dry. I needed that in case of rain. I needed that in case of anything that could possibly happen. The phone fly off the bike, something like that. I would need to make sure that the phone survived because that was my only method of communication. It was my GPS. So it was the phone itself is a very, very important part of my total packing. And if a phone got lost or damaged, that would be a big problem. So a protective case for the phone, something not quite listed in the risks, but of course you needed to power the devices. So I ended up getting a USB adapter to do that. I needed to provide power to the camera and the phone, so I made sure I got a dual device to make sure that the devices had plenty of power. So I didn't want the phone dying because GPS does eat a lot of your battery. So that's how I took care of that. Getting tired, that kind of goes into your planning phases of your trip. You want to make sure you give yourself adequate time at rest stops. Stop 30, 45 minutes a time. But this was a risk that I had to kind of accept, but that I wanted to make sure I did everything I could to avoid it if possible. And pain. I bought a new seat for one, to make sure I tried to avoid some of the pain and discomforts. And then I brought a bag full of my favorite painkillers, which sometimes I ate like candy just to make sure I kept the pain off of me as best as I could. So these are the risks that I felt the trip brought, and as a result, these are the things that I did. I tried everything I could to anticipate what would and would not be a problem. Losing money, the mitigation that I chose for losing money was cash. In particular, I thought about if I lost my debit card. The best solution, based on personal experience, that I can suggest when it comes to traveling, and this was given to me by a friend of mine, I can't take credit for this. If you use a debit or credit card, keep it separate from your wallet, both from a theft perspective and a loss perspective. If this is your critical means of using money on your trip, keep it someplace else. Keep it in your breast pocket, keep it in a backpack, keep it separate from your wallet. Sounds kind of counterintuitive, but if you do like I did, which is where you lost your wallet, then your debit and credit card will be kept safe. Cash, I actually considered but did not, sadly. I just thought about taking out several $100s in cash as a backup and just stuffing it in my helmet liner, because I knew I would never leave without my helmet in any circumstance. So I didn't do that, should have, because I would have actually kept my cash had I lost my wallet, and I would have been okay. So again, losing money, losing your wallet, I didn't think that would happen to me. I'm an avid checker. I'm constantly paranoid, checking my pockets to make sure my wallet's still in a good spot, and I still lost it. So something to consider. keeping critical cash, critical charge cards away from your wallet in a place where if you lose the cards, you don't lose your wallet. If you lose your wallet, you don't lose your cards, things like that. Those are the risks associated with the trip. And Jeff, that, looking at the risks and looking at the time will allow you to do the next thing, which is route planning. Now, we go back to my goals, which were visiting friends and family. All right, well, if that's a major goal, I'm terrible with spelling, I'm sorry. If this is my number one goal, which is visiting friends and family, I want to have the most amount of time possible to do that. Which means that I am going to have less time available to ride really good roads, because really good roads are not the interstate. It's a sort of, time versus fun ratio. And the interstate is on the time side. We'll call them back roads. Is on the fun side. If you can split the two, that's fun. Unfortunately, this is what I had to choose, because time was the most important thing. I wanted to have the most amount of time possible to visit my friends and family. So I had to choose the interstate. That basically really shrunk the amount of available roads that I would be able to take. There's only really two ways, if to get to, here's Indiana, here's Arizona. There's only really two ways to do it. One is a southern route. The other one is a northern route. Now, that's not drawn to scale or accuracy, but it gives you the idea. Northern route takes you through Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, eventually Illinois, and actually in Indiana. The southern route is New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and then up through Indiana. Those are the two routes to take. Time-wise, believe it or not, they're fairly approximate. The distance is fairly similar between the two. The difference is where they go. Now, originally, I thought about taking a southern route, but I've driven this route before. So it's a long time ago. So I've been on that route before, but it's been a long time. I have been on the northern route, but only from Indiana to Arizona. So been on both ways, but it's been a long time between each one of them. Chances are it's going to be fairly new scenery, no matter which way I go. The difference is I did want to stop in Denver. So once I decided that I wanted to go to Denver, the northern route became the default route to get back to Indiana. Something to take into consideration as well later on was weather. United States is a big country. Weather can differ greatly between the southern route and the northern route. Where you're at, you may not have a choice. You may only have one route. You may have several routes. It all depends on the time and distance. So the other thing was, too, some areas that I knew that I would be in. I knew I would be in St. Louis because I have family there, and I knew I may be in Kansas City as well. So when you're doing your route planning, you're also looking at, total distance and miles you can travel. And again, your miles you can travel is a daytime estimate. Don't think of it in terms of how far can you go overall, because you're merely limited by budget and by time in that respect. So going to Indiana, the northern route was set, but I decided that I would keep the return trip open. One, because I had not announced over social media that I was doing this. I kept that totally under wraps. So I knew once I announced in Indiana to everybody that I knew that, hey, I'm on this motorcycle trip, this is where I'm at, some people might pop up and say, hey man, come visit me. And if it was a person that I may have wanted to see, or maybe didn't plan to see because I didn't think they were available, I might want to change my plans. So I decided to let the return trip sort of build itself. I didn't want to keep that rigid, because if I did, I might miss an opportunity to see someone. So this is where I kind of split the difference between, you know, the get on and ride and the plan. I decided when I got back to Indiana that I would make the decision at that point about which route I was going to go, because by that time I knew how far I could ride. I knew how long it would take me to get from one side to the other, which in this case for me was 5 to 6 days, depending on how far I was going or what was happening. So instead of 4 days, it was more like 5 to 6 max, because you want to build in a buffer in case of weather. Especially the longer the trip, the more likely weather will be to derail you. And in the case of the southern route, weather was a serious problem. In areas like Texas, and even like Oklahoma, there were tornadoes, there was hail, there was nasty storms, and even there's actually a slightly more northern route that you could take that would take you through like Iowa and Nebraska. And this up here was also trash. Nebraska was seeing really bad tornadoes and hail. Iowa was getting a little bit of a brunt of it. So you had two weather systems that were moving through the northern part and the southern part of the country, leaving really the only safe corridor through Kansas. Now, as the series progresses, you guys will see that I did come into contact with some of the storms in those areas. It was definitely not a foolproof decision. But after consideration and looking at the weather in particular, I decided that it was going to be way more risky to go the southern route that I had not been on in this trip. So I didn't know the frequency of gas stations. I didn't know where a good place to stop would be. And then you add the possibility of really nasty weather. Too risky, not worth it, especially when I'm on my return trip. All I want to do is get home. So I decided that I would take the same route back. Bonus is I get to stop in Denver again, hang out with friends. Hey guys, all right. I'm sorry for the cutaway. For some reason, I think probably because I had the Wi-Fi turned on for the camera. It's probably 95 degrees here in the garage, and I think the camera actually shut off because of the heat, if you can believe that. So it died right when I was kind of talking about the route planning. So I'm going to try and pick up from there. We're almost done with the planning segment. I'm just going to try and recap a little bit of where I was. So basically, I made determinations about going back and following the same route due to a combination of weather as well as being familiar with the route. I decided not to take a second or separate route back as a result of some of the things that I was seeing with the weather. So as a result of that, I made my determination to take the same route back to Phoenix, mainly because I knew how long it would take me to go. I knew the time frame between stops. I did make a couple of alterations. For example, I started in southern Indiana, excuse me, on day one of my return trip because I wanted to visit a friend of mine down in southern Indiana, which kind of altered my trip because instead of stopping in Kansas City, I decided to stop in Columbia to see my cousin again. And then instead of stopping in Kansas City like I did coming out, which was a real short trip that day, I just kept going to Colby. So I did make a couple of small alterations, but overall the trip remained very much the same. So I wanted to just recap so you kind of see how my planning strategy fits together and everything that we've done. So we started out with determining the amount of time that you would have available, and I apologize, my markers are dying here. You wanted to start out with the amount of time that was available, and Jesus, you wanted to do, then you had to determine the distance that you were going to be going. So once you knew the time that you would have available, in this case it was 3 weeks for me, the distance approximately 5,000 miles. Based on some of the routes that I was doing, I knew I could do between 400 and 500 miles per day of riding. So with that in mind, then we assess the risks involved with the trip. Obviously, we know some of the risks were weather. Some of the risks were crashes, breaking down, so on and so forth. Obviously, some of the risks were weather, crashes, and breaking down. Once we had the risks determined, then I did the route. And the reason why, I started with planning the route, but I realized that I couldn't plan the route without knowing the distance, because I didn't know the time that I would have. I knew the time that was available. I knew the distance that was available in terms of approximately how far I would have to go. But in addition to the route, actually, before I'm a little bit out of order, I apologize. But then we identified, come on, marker, the goals of the trip, which were to see family and friends. So the thing that's cool in my mind, or what's really beneficial, is the route ends up sort of building itself, because the total amount of time that's available feeds into the route. The distance that I can go every day, let's say for the most part, when I say distance, I'm talking about the total amount of miles that I can do on a daily basis. That influences the route. The risks, whether it be the weather, crashes, breaking down, etc., that influences the route. And so do the goals. If my goal was to go on a riding trip, my route is going to differ substantially, because I want to take more mountain roads, more back roads, more country roads. That also will influence the amount of time that I have. How much time do I have to see, to visit? If my goal is not to see friends and family necessarily, then I'm going to build in more time for riding. And of course, your route also is predetermined by the risks. There are certain risks with taking mountain roads or back roads that you don't necessarily have with the interstate. The interstates are going to be more heavily populated, more flat and straight, more accessible to gas stations, things like that. So for me, planning the route was one of the last things that I did. It seems counterintuitive, but once you understand the time you have available, the total distance you can ride every day, the risks that are associated, and the goals, you can then plan the route. And that allowed me for the route to just sort of come together. Now, there's only really a couple of ways across the United States for that much distance, but it did help me determine that I really wasn't going to be able to deviate very far from some of those, from the interstate, because time was going to be a factor. The more time I was on the road, the less time I had to see friends and family. And that was the main goal of this trip. So if your goal is a riding trip, if your goal is to ride as many roads, because for example, let me kind of backtrack a little bit. Say your goal is to ride through all 50 states. no matter what, no matter how briefly or otherwise you are in a state, you want to ride through all 50 states. There is actually a route that's available on the web of a route the shortest route you could take in the United States to ride through all 48 states, not including Hawaii or Alaska. So riding through all 50 states would be quite an endeavor. So at least all through all lower 48 states, if that was your goal, your route is going to be much different than if it was simply, well, I want to ride some of the best roads in the Southwest. Or I want to have a visiting trip, but I want to have some fun riding too. You see how your route is very, very much influenced by all of these other areas, and planning the route first without addressing goals, risks, distance, or time is really going to produce something that is unachievable on one or multiple of these levels. That's pretty much it. Again, this is my process. This is not the process. My goal with this was to simply give you a starting point for planning your own trip. Like I said, there are some people that like to just get on the bike and go. That's cool. There are some people like myself who wanted to plan because this was something I had never done before. This was probably one of the biggest single personal goals that I've achieved in a very long time, certainly. And I wanted to make sure that I planned everything as well as I could, because I didn't want anything to go wrong. And if something did go wrong, which there were things that did go wrong, that I was as prepared as possible. I didn't want anything to deviate from the trip, and I didn't want anything to destroy the trip. And I was afraid that if I didn't spend a significant amount of time planning it, that it would have been an ultimate failure. So please leave your comments, your questions below. I'm really interested to try and help as many people as possible who are interested in planning their own motorcycle trip. There are a ton of different ways that you guys can do this. This is not the only way, and I just want to keep reiterating that, because part of the freedom of owning a motorcycle is being able to do and ride how you want to. And that includes planning a trip. Plan a trip that you want. There are some people that will plan trips that want to camp, where staying at a location is not really, it's wherever my camp for the night is wherever I park my bike. There are tons of different ways that people carry out motorcycle trips. And it's up to you to determine what it is that you want out of the trip. And if you want to plan, then plan accordingly. And if planning is if avoiding the plan is part of your goal, then do that as well. So please leave your comments and questions, and I would love to provide as much insight as I can as to how I did this and what went into the planning phases. Thank you very much for watching. I know this was kind of a long video, but I wanted to give you as much detail as I could for those of you who have had questions about what I did and why I did it. So thank you very much for those of you who have watched through the entire video. I appreciate your patience, and looking forward to seeing you all out there. Take care.